Julia Morton buried her husband 15 years ago, grief-stricken, alone, and convinced he had died in the forests of Oregon. But while vacationing in the UK, she saw him, alive, laughing, holding hands with another woman and 2 children who called him Dad. What she did next uncovered a trail of lies, a hidden identity and a secret life he never meant for anyone, especially her, to find. Julia Morton always thought of herself as an ordinary woman living an ordinary life. In the sleepy town of Clearwater, Oregon, her days followed a rhythm as predictable as the rain that drizzled endlessly from gray skies. She was a nurse at the local clinic, a mother to 2 energetic children, and a wife to Daniel, a man she trusted completely. They'd been high school sweethearts, married young, and stuck together through every storm life threw at them. Daniel was a high school English teacher. He had a quiet confidence, the kind of man who remembered birthdays, mowed the lawn every Saturday, and kissed her forehead before leaving for work. He was, by every account, a good man. On the morning of May 17, 2009, Daniel packed his fishing gear and kissed Julia goodbye. He told her he was heading out to Crater Lake for the weekend, a solo fishing trip, something he did once or twice a year to clear his head. Julia thought nothing of it. He'd done this before, always returned with a sunburn and a cooler full of trout. She made him a sandwich, reminded him to wear sunscreen, and watched him drive off. That was the last time she ever saw him. 2 days passed without a call, but Julia didn't worry at first. Crater Lake was remote and cell service was notoriously bad. By the 3rd day, her stomach began to knot. She left voicemails that were never returned. That evening, she drove to the lake herself, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. The park rangers were polite but concerned. A search was launched immediately. Daniel's car was found parked near a hiking trail. The driver's door was unlocked. His wallet was on the passenger seat. His fishing pole and tackle box were in the trunk, untouched. His wedding ring sat inside the glove compartment. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn clothing, nothing to suggest foul play. It was as if he had simply vanished. Volunteers, dogs, helicopters, and drones scoured the forest for weeks. Julia stood in the rain, watching strangers comb through underbrush and shout his name. She tried to stay hopeful, but each day without answers chipped away at her resolve. The media briefly picked up the story. Local teacher missing in Crater Lake wilderness. Some speculated he had been attacked by wildlife. Others whispered darker theories, that maybe he'd taken his own life. But there was no note, no goodbye, no reason. Eventually, the search was called off. The official conclusion was that Daniel had likely slipped while hiking and fallen into one of the steep, forested ravines that lined the area. His body had never been recovered. Julia clung to the tiny hope that he had somehow survived, that maybe he had amnesia, or was injured and couldn't return. But as months turned into a year, and the insurance claim was processed, reality began to set in. The state issued a death certificate. He was declared legally dead. Julia held a memorial service with an empty casket. Friends brought flowers, hugged her awkwardly, and whispered how tragic it all was. But none of them could understand what it felt like to tuck 2 children into bed and lie when they asked if Daddy was really gone. None of them knew the way silence could become unbearable in a house that used to echo with laughter. He went through his things, his books, his clothes, his notebooks, and boxed them away. Nothing offered any clues. There were no signs that he was planning to leave, no unexplained withdrawals from their joint accounts, no strange behavior in the days leading up to the trip. It was as if he had stepped into thin air. But sometimes, late at night, when the house was still and her thoughts too loud to ignore, Julia felt something she couldn't explain. Not just grief, but unease. A tug at her mind, like a thread that hadn't quite unraveled. Something didn't feel right. There were too many things that didn't make sense. The untouched gear, the ring, the calm, deliberate arrangement of it all. And deep down, buried under years of forced acceptance, a quiet suspicion began to take root. One that would lie dormant until, 15 years later, a chance encounter in a foreign city would blow everything wide open. The years that followed Daniel's disappearance moved slowly, like molasses in winter. In the beginning, Julia could barely function. Each morning was a battle, getting out of bed, getting the kids ready for school, pretending she wasn't falling apart. She moved through life like a ghost, speaking when spoken to, smiling when expected, and crying only when no one could see. The town of Clearwater, once her comforting bubble of familiarity, began to feel like a place frozen in time. Every corner reminded her of Daniel, his favorite diner, the bookstore where he used to grade papers on weekends, the bench where he proposed. Eventually, the wait became too much. 2 years after his disappearance, Julia packed up the house, sold it to a young couple, and moved to Boise, Idaho. It wasn't far, but it was far enough to start over without being haunted by memories. She found a small home near a quiet street, got a job at a medical clinic, and focused on raising her children. On the outside, she looked like someone slowly rebuilding, but inside, the questions never stopped echoing. The kids grew quickly. Birthdays came and went, first steps, first school plays, graduations. Daniel missed them all. Julia tried to be enough for them. Some days she succeeded, others she failed. Every year she visited Crater Lake alone on the anniversary of his disappearance. She would sit by the water, sometimes for hours, and imagine what had happened in those final moments. Did he fall? Did he suffer? Or was he even there at all? The thought came uninvited and unwelcome. She hated herself for thinking it. Still, the possibility nagged at her. The evidence had always felt too neat, too convenient. The untouched gear, the ring left in the glove box. It was as if someone had staged a scene, carefully curated for others to find. But who would do such a thing? And why? Julia never voiced these thoughts aloud. Not to her children, not to her therapist, not even to herself in the mirror. To survive, she needed to believe the story she had been told, that Daniel was dead, that he had died tragically, and that there was nothing she could have done. She buried herself in routine: work, home, errands, sleep. It was the only way to stay sane. Over time, the pain dulled, softening into a quiet ache. She smiled more, though it rarely reached her eyes. She made friends in Boise, surface-level friendships built on coffee dates and PTA meetings. No one there knew the full story, and she preferred it that way. In a place where no one remembered Daniel, she could almost forget, too. Years passed, the world changed, phones got smarter, the kids grew taller, but one thing never changed: the dream. It came at random, sometimes months apart, sometimes back-to-back nights. In it, Daniel would stand just out of reach, always turned slightly away, always walking somewhere she couldn't follow. He never spoke, but he always looked over his shoulder, just once, as if daring her to follow. He tried to dismiss it as a grief-induced hallucination, but the feeling lingered, a gnawing certainty that he wasn't gone, that he had chosen to disappear. On her 50th birthday, her daughter surprised her with a plane ticket, a 2-week trip to Europe, all expenses paid. "You need this," she said. "You never do anything for yourself." Julia hesitated. She'd never been out of the country, but something inside her shifted. Maybe it was time. Maybe, finally, she could let go. Maybe the distance would help her bury the past for good. She'd packed light: a few books, a scarf Daniel once gave her, and the wedding ring he left behind, still hidden in the same velvet box. She didn't know why she brought it. Maybe it was habit. Or maybe, somewhere deep in her subconscious, she already knew that the past wasn't finished with her yet, that across an ocean, in a city she had never seen, the answers she'd been afraid to find were waiting. And what she would discover there would shatter everything she thought she knew. The flight to London was long, and Julia spent most of it staring out the window, her thoughts adrift somewhere between the clouds and memories she had long tried to bury. It had been over 15 years since Daniel disappeared, and though she had told herself again and again that she was at peace, the truth was more complicated. There was a dull weight she carried, invisible but ever-present. She hoped the trip might finally lighten it, if only a little. London greeted her with gray skies and a chill wind that reminded her strangely of Oregon. The old city felt like a dream, layers of history folded into narrow streets and towering cathedrals. On her third day, Julia decided to explore the Tower of London. It was a tourist-heavy area, and she normally avoided crowds, but something about the idea of ancient walls and unsolved mysteries felt oddly fitting. She wandered along the outer walkways, sipping tea from a paper cup, letting herself enjoy the anonymity of being alone in a city of strangers. That's when it happened. As she stood near a corner cafe, her eyes caught movement across the street. A man walking casually, hand in hand with a young boy and a little girl skipping beside him. A woman, tall, brunette, smiling, walked just a step behind. At first, it didn't register. Then Julia's breath caught in her throat. It was the way he moved, the tilt of his head when he laughed, the scar on his chin. It was him. Daniel. Everything around her seemed to slow, the bustle of tourists and the sound of passing traffic dulling into a low hum. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She stared, afraid to blink in case the image vanished. But it didn't. The man looked 15 years older, with grayer hair and a beard, but there was no mistaking him. She watched in stunned silence as he lifted his daughter into his arms, pointing at something in the distance, smiling like a man without a care in the world. Then he turned slightly, and that was it. The profile, the curve of his jaw, the same slight hitch in his step. It wasn't someone who looked like Daniel. It was Daniel. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She followed them, keeping her distance, careful not to draw attention. They walked casually, like a family on holiday, chatting and laughing. He held the woman's hand. Julia couldn't comprehend it. Daniel had been declared dead. She had buried him in every way she knew how, and yet here he was, living a new life as if none of it had ever happened. They entered a modest hotel near Tower Hill. Julia waited across the street, hidden behind a row of parked bicycles. Minutes passed. An hour. 2. She didn't move. When Daniel finally stepped out alone, Julia raised her phone and snapped a photo. Her hands trembled. She stared at the screen, her mind spinning, her heart pounding. The image was clear. There he was, caught in a moment he never thought anyone from his past would see. He looked older, more weathered. But it was undeniably him. Back in her hotel room that night, Julia laid the new photo beside an old one she had stored in her phone. One of the last pictures they had taken together before his disappearance. There was no denying it. The eyes, the nose, the small scar on his temple from a bike accident in college. It was all there. Her hands shook as she zoomed in, examining every feature. The weight she had carried for so long was no longer grief, it was confusion, betrayal, and something darker. If he had been alive this whole time, then everything she had believed for the last 15 years had been a lie. Her sorrow, her children's pain, the endless unanswered questions, it had all been built on a deception. The next morning she contacted a private investigator. She wanted answers, and now, for the first time in over a decade, she had something real to pursue, something that could not be explained away or ignored. She didn't know who that man across the street had become, but he had once been her husband, and she was going to find out why he had chosen to vanish from one life, just to build another. Anthony Blake had been working as a private investigator in London for over 20 years. He had seen his share of cheating spouses, fake injury claims, and the occasional missing person. But when Julia showed him the photograph, and told him the man had been declared legally dead 15 years earlier in Oregon, he leaned in closer, intrigued. He agreed to take the case, promising to be discreet and thorough. Over the following week, Julia heard from Blake only once, to confirm he had started digging. She tried to distract herself by visiting museums, going on river cruises, and browsing antique shops. But her mind never strayed far from that moment outside the cafe. The way Daniel had looked so at ease, so completely absorbed in his new life. There was no trace of guilt in his expression, no hesitation in his steps. It was as if the past had never happened. Then Blake called. He had identified the man. According to the hotel's check-in records, he had signed in as David Morgan, a Canadian citizen with a current address in Bath, England. He had a British wife named Claire and 2 children, Emma and Theo. There were social media profiles that supported the story. Family pictures, holiday posts, smiling selfies. The man appeared to be a loving father, a devoted husband, and an average middle-aged tourist. There was only one problem. David Morgan didn't exist before 2011. Blake's voice grew serious as he explained. The earliest digital footprint of the man began suddenly. No school records, no employment history, no official documentation before that year. His passport was valid, but further checks showed it had been issued in Vancouver in 2011 under emergency circumstances. His driver's license, bank records, and even his professional credentials were just as thin, all originating shortly after the same date. There were gaps, inconsistencies, things that didn't quite add up unless you were looking for them. But Blake was looking. Using facial recognition software and a few backdoor resources, he ran a comparison between David Morgan and old photos from U.S. missing persons databases. The results came back with a 97% match. Daniel Morton of Clearwater, Oregon, legally dead, emotionally buried, spiritually vanished. Blake also uncovered something else, something that made Julia's stomach twist. 6 months before Daniel disappeared, he had taken out a separate life insurance policy, naming a business associate named Alan Price as the beneficiary. Julia had never heard the name before. Daniel had never mentioned any business partner. The payout was issued just 7 weeks after Daniel went missing, over $200,000, 0 cents, deposited into a Canadian bank account under Alan Price's name. The account had been closed 3 months later, the money withdrawn in full. Alan Price, too, had vanished. As Blake explained all of this over the phone, Julia sat motionless in her hotel room, staring at the walls as if they might collapse under the weight of the truth. Daniel hadn't been lost in the woods or dragged off by wildlife. He had staged everything. Left his wallet behind, left his wedding ring, left her, with 2 children and a lifetime of questions. And then he had walked away from it all. But why? Debt? A secret life? An affair? Was Claire part of it, or just another chapter in the elaborate fiction he had built? Blake didn't have those answers yet, but he assured her more was coming. Julia hung up and sat in silence, the sound of the city beyond her window a dull, distant murmur. The pieces were falling into place now, one by one, but they weren't forming a clear picture, just a distorted image of a man. She thought she knew, now unrecognizable. She looked again at the photo she'd taken. Not at the man this time, but at the children beside him. They had no idea who their father really was, and that was the most chilling part of all. The train ride from London to Bath was quiet and gray, much like Julia's thoughts. She sat by the window, her fingers tight around a leather-bound notebook filled with every detail Blake had uncovered. Addresses, dates, names, bank records, pieces of a life that had never truly ended, only changed course. She had wrestled with the decision to come in person, unsure what she would do once she arrived. Would she confront him, expose him, or simply watch, just to see if he ever looked over his shoulder? Bath was beautiful, serene. The Georgian buildings stood like stoic sentinels, timeless and clean. Julia felt like an intruder walking its cobbled streets, carrying the weight of a history no one around her could see. She found the house easily. A modest stone home with flower beds out front and toys scattered across the lawn. It looked warm, happy, normal. She stood across the street for nearly an hour, her gaze fixed on the windows. Eventually the front door opened. A boy and girl burst out laughing, racing toward a silver SUV parked in the drive. Then came Claire, who called after them with a smile, her arms full of snacks and water bottles. And finally, him, Daniel, or David, or whatever he called himself now. He carried a folded map and wore sunglasses, but she didn't need to see his eyes to know him. She knew the way he walked, the way he gestured while talking, the small tilt of his head when listening. He looked unburdened, as if the man who once walked out of a marriage, a family, and a life had left behind not just his name, but his conscience too. Julia felt her throat tighten. There had been a part of her, buried under the anger and confusion, that hoped he might look haunted, that some shadow of what he'd done would linger behind his smile, but there was nothing. He laughed easily, kissed his wife's cheek, buckled his daughter into the car. The kind of gestures that once belonged to Julia and her children. The car pulled out and she let it pass without moving. She felt frozen in place, caught between past and present like some forgotten artifact no one knew how to classify. Later that evening she sat in a quiet cafe, phone in hand. Blake had sent her one last message, a copy of a report from 2009 filed in Oregon under a different name. A real estate transaction. A sale. Just weeks before Daniel disappeared, he had liquidated an old family property Julia never knew existed, land in Maple inherited from an uncle he'd told her had left nothing behind. The money from the sale had gone into the same Canadian bank account as the insurance payout. He hadn't vanished in a moment of weakness or fear. He had planned it. Julia stared at the paper until the words blurred. Then, slowly, she stood and walked to the riverside. The water moved calmly beneath the stone bridge, indifferent to the turmoil inside her. She thought of their children, of the years they had cried, hoped, moved forward, of every tear she'd swallowed for their sake. They didn't know yet. She hadn't told them. He didn't know if she ever would. The truth was no longer just about Daniel. It was about the life he had stolen, not just from her, but from them. The lies he had lived, the innocence of the children he was now raising under a false name, built on a foundation of abandonment and betrayal. As the sky darkened, Julia made her decision. She wouldn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, she would wait. Watch, learn more. He had built a new life on secrets. Now, she held the power of truth. And she wasn't done digging. Not even close.